Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, Yemen, the media, and the learning curve. Are they getting the story straight?
Many are asking, is Yemen the next Afghanistan?
Freedom of the press in Macao, 10 years after the colony was handed over to China.
Macao has a well-developed media industry.
Ireland and blasphemy via the World Wide Web. And Jib Jab does the job on the news year that was 2009.
No, there has never been one like 09.
For the global news media, the past 2 weeks have been a crash course on a little-known country that's being called the new front in the war on terror. The media spotlight started to swing towards Yemen on Christmas Day when a young Nigerian man tried and failed to bring down an American airliner destined for Detroit. The Yemen connection was established when it was revealed that the would-be bomber had studied in the capital, Sana'a, and an al-Qaeda website claimed responsibility for the plot. All of a sudden, reporters from all kinds of news organizations were making their way to a place most of them had never been. Our starting point this week is Yemen, an important story in an unfamiliar country that has the news media groping for information, insight, and understanding. Ask yourself what you knew about Yemen prior to the recent blitz of reporting from there. You probably did not know how many people live there or how poor they are. You were probably unaware of the low literacy rate, that the government is led by a slight Sunni majority and is fighting a civil war in the north against Shia rebels. But you probably did know that one man, a Saudi, has roots in Yemen.
Western reporters love to mention the fact that Yemen is the ancestral home of Osama bin Laden, because bin Laden's father lived in Yemen. They mention that as if it somehow has any relevance to al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in 2010. And it really doesn't. But it sort of paints this picture of Yemen as this country full of terrorists, full of al-Qaeda sympathizers, when in reality it's a country where the majority of people don't sympathize with al-Qaeda. It's a country with a long history of moderate Islam.
Threats from an al-Qaeda offshoot.
And that one aspect of the story, the preoccupation with bin Laden and his bloodlines, encapsulates the problem with much of the coverage of Yemen in the global news media.
Does one of the poorest nations in the Arab world have what it takes to try to go up against al-Qaeda?
They are focusing on one thing, terrorism and the radicalization, but they don't go beyond that to understand the reason.
I think there's a danger in the Western media coverage of Yemen of slipping into a very well-worn narrative that we've seen time and time again since 9/11. Yes, some of those issues are present in this story, and yes, some of the risks are present in this country. But I think it's really important that we get beyond that very tired narrative that we've heard time and time again.
Many are asking, is Yemen the next Afghanistan?
The Western media coverage of Yemen has been very one-dimensional. It's been very focused on al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, al-Qaeda in Yemen. And it's ignored the other big conflicts in Yemen. It's really been focused on this one dimension of terrorism.
The rest of Americans who fly in airplanes are going to pay the penalty for this crazy terrorist stuff.
And it's been from a Western perspective.
What is the feeling of the citizens of Yemen toward the United States?
The real focus for the Arabic media over the last few months has been the Houthi conflict, which a couple of months ago drew in Saudi Arabia. So they've been focused on covering that conflict, and their coverage of the bombing plot has been considerably less than the English language coverage.
What's really interesting about the disparity in coverage on Yemen between English language media and Arabic language media is the preoccupation in the West with terrorism as the primary issue, even the only issue that people are concerned about. In the region, in the Arab media, and there's a much better understanding of the internal issues that are affecting the country, a much better understanding of the broad nature of the challenges that currently face the Yemeni government.
Challenges such as Yemen is a resource and demographic time bomb. The country's water supply and its oil production are both expected to dry up within a decade. 75% of the population is 25 years of age or younger. These are the kinds of facts that provide context, but they are often lost when foreign reporters parachute into places like Yemen and treat the story as breaking news.
It is very challenging because when you report on something, you need to understand it first. The problem with many foreign reports is that they do not understand what they are reporting, and they give a first impression of someone whose thinking is formed elsewhere. So they see it as something novel, but not necessarily something real.
I think there's a number of challenges involved for Western journalists trying to report in Yemen. I mean, the primary issue now is security. It's becoming increasingly difficult for journalists to leave the capital and to travel around the country. So there are physical restrictions on people's ability to report.
Much of the country is off limits to journalists, particularly to Western journalists. Sada province in the north, where the Houthi conflict is raging, that's entirely off limits. Shebwa province, where al-Qaeda is believed to have its strongest presence, that's off limits. Parts of the south are off limits. So there's a practical challenge. And then also, for Western reporters, there's a cultural challenge, because this is a complex society. There's a complicated relationship between the central government and the tribes in remote parts of the country outside of Sana'a. It's a difficult country to try and quickly understand.
And when reporters and their photographers are unable to take their own pictures, their news organizations rely on images from outside sources, such as Al-Qaeda.
These are videos, these are photographs that are posted by essentially the media wing or the propaganda wing of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And they're posted on the internet, and then they're disseminated on forums and by organizations in the West that monitor terror groups. Al-Qaeda is happy to have these out there. Most intelligence officials say there are only a few hundred active members in Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So these videos act as almost like a force multiplier. They allow the group to portray itself as being much larger and much more influential than it actually is. So they're happy to get these images out there.
And the mainstream media are happy to use them.
Al-Qaeda has found a new safe haven.
If you're looking for a web-based alternative for news and information on Yemen, we recommend a site called Wak al-Wak. The address is islamandininsurgencyinyemen.blogspot.com. A Sana-based journalist named Nasser Arabayi blogs in both English and Arabic on Yemen at narabayi-e.blogspot.com. And sanabureau.wordpress.com is also useful. It's an aggregator, a site that posts informative articles about Yemen from a multitude of sources. And while you're at it, you might want to bookmark those sites. Yemen is in the news, and it looks like it's going to stay there. Here's how our Global Village voices see the coverage of the Yemen story.
I'm extremely concerned about the way that the media has been dealing with Yemen, especially the Western media. It's ignoring all the past. In fact, the real story here is that why is it that the Western media in particular is failing to highlight what is going on in Yemen? Why is it that this state is becoming a failed state? And why is it that is allowing both the Saudis and the Americans to come and bomb at will its own civilians and its own population?
Instead of preventing terrorism, the debate here in America seems to be focused on who is to blame and how to gain political capital. Muslims in particular are feeling the pressure as the discussion also focuses on requiring separate lines for Muslims at airports. The issue has become a political football that will play hard in this year's elections in which Obama's Democratic majority will lose some seats in both the House and the Senate.
We are now closing in on 4,000 viewers following us on Facebook and Twitter. They check in to find out what stories we're working on in case they want to weigh in as one of our Global Village voices. If you'd like to do the same, just go to either of those sites and search us out, or you can get in touch with us the old-fashioned way on email. We're at listeningpost@aljazeera.net. Time now for some quick hits from the world of global media. Listening Post News Bites. Beijing is throwing more money at state media outlets as China continues to try to increase its influence around the globe. Last year, China launched a new English language newspaper called The Global Times, as well as television channels that broadcast in Arabic and Russian. This year, it has plans for 2 more channels that will broadcast in English, including a business channel described as a Chinese CNN. In addition to trying to make its voice heard around the world, the new outlets are a way for Beijing to counter the trend of its people going online for news content. China has more internet users than any other country, as many as 360 million. India's press council is investigating allegations that media outlets are selling news coverage to politicians. A report in an English-language magazine called Outlook, entitled News You Can Abuse, contained several stories of politicians who accuse news outlets of taking money in exchange for favorable coverage. Newspapers as well as TV news channels have been implicated. One politician said that a channel told him that if he paid enough money, the channel could even arrange crowds to attend his political rallies. One member of the press council investigating the trend told Outlook magazine this is a cancer that is afflicting Indian media as a whole. It is undermining the very process of democracy. The New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists is accusing the government of Azerbaijan of planting drugs on a jailed news editor in order to keep him in prison. Aynullah Fatullayev is already serving an 8-year sentence for defamation and incitement of ethnic hatred. The 2 newspapers that he edited, both of which were critical of the government, have been closed. Fatullayev has taken his case to the European Court of Human Rights, alleging unjust prosecution. The Committee to Protect Journalists says the drug charge is a fabrication that the authorities are using to keep Fatullayev in jail should he win his case at the European Court. Canada has lost its first journalist to the war in Afghanistan. Michelle Lang, a 34-year-old newspaper reporter for the Calgary Herald, was killed in the city of Kandahar. She and 4 Canadian soldiers she was covering on a patrol were all casualties of a roadside bomb. Lang was one of 2 reporters killed in the past year in Afghanistan. The other, Sultan Munadi, was an Afghan who was shot and killed when British forces tried to free Munadi and his New York Times colleague Stephen Farrell from kidnappers. Munadi's family and his friends are still pushing for an inquiry into the rescue mission, questioning if the raid was really necessary and why it was that Munadi's body was left behind by the British. An Irish atheist group is using the World Wide Web to launch a challenge against the country's new blasphemy law. Under the law, anyone publishing abusive or insulting material against any religion and thereby causing outrage will be subject to a fine of up to $35,000. In a provocative response, a group calling itself Atheist Ireland posted 25 potentially blasphemous quotations on its website from various writers and intellectuals, as well as from Pope Benedict and Jesus Christ. Ireland has had a blasphemy law since 1937, but the wording was vague, and the government says the new law is meant to protect all religious groups, not just Catholics, from blasphemy. Critics of the new law say it's silly and literally medieval. We're back after the break with a piece on that other colony that was handed back to China during the 90s, Macao.